Good evening and welcome to the IOP's Speaker Series event, Trumpian Tumult, What Europe's Meltdown Means for Us. My name is Arya Sharma and I am a first year in the college from Austin, Texas. I am double majoring in public policy and economics. At the IOP, I am a Fellows Ambassador, a staff reporter for The Gate, and a member of UC Dems. I was engaged in the election this past November, and I am particularly interested in seeing how President Trump's victory will impact U.S. foreign relations. I'm honored to be introducing our panelists today, who will be discussing the critical challenges facing Europe and their implications for the United States. Tonight, we are joined by an outstanding group of panelists. Maurizio Caprara is an Italian journalist for the Evening News, where he primarily focuses on issues regarding international politics. He previously served as both an advisor and the director of the Office for Press and Communication for the President of Italy. Dalibor Rohak is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, studying European political and economic trends. He specifically focuses on Central and Eastern Europe, the EU, and US-EU relations. He previously served as a policy analyst with the Cato's Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity and an economist at the London-based Legatum Institute, where he worked on topics ranging from the Eurozone crisis to economic transitions in the Arab world. Laura Thornton is a senior director of global democracy programs at the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, where she works to forge alliances across borders and support frontline democracies through policy outreach. She previously served as the senior vice president of the Democracy Hub at the German Marshall Fund, where she oversaw the Alliance for Securing Democracy. David M. Herzenhorn will serve as our moderator. David currently serves as the Russia, Ukraine, and East Europe editor at the Washington Post. He previously served as the Brussels correspondent for Politico Europe and as a Metro reporter, Washington correspondent, and foreign correspondent based in Moscow for the New York Times. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. Second, when it is time for the Q&A, someone will place a microphone in the audience. And as usual, we will give priority for the first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check upcoming IOP events, including the Policy Challenge Super Bowl, where you can watch student teams from the University of Chicago, University of Cincinnati, and University of Kansas compete with their urban-rural divide policy proposals, judged by former U.S. Senator and IOP Pritzker Fellow John Tester. And Walls Are Witnesses, The Future of Black Chicago, which will take place Tuesday, February 4th at 5:30 in Ida Noy's Cloister Club. Please make sure to check out the IOP's website for more on future Speaker Series events and other opportunities at the Institute of Politics. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Maurizio Caprara, Dalibor Rohak, Laura Thornton, and David M. Herzenhorn.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to see you, and thanks to the Institute of Politics for organizing this, my great friend Jennifer Steinhauer and her team, and to Arya for that terrific introduction.
Exactly.
It's really great to be with you all. So, word is that Europe is a mess politically, while everything is going fabulously in Washington. That's not quite it. But actually, I did want to, and I have notes in all directions, I did want to read you a little something that I wrote for Politico Europe just under 4 years ago, I guess now, to give you a sense of how this relationship sometimes works. The story began with Joe Biden preparing for his first trip abroad as president. European leaders are noticing a change in the transatlantic air. The hostile and nasty American arrogance of Donald Trump is gone, replaced by the more polite and friendly American arrogance that they remember, not always fondly, from their dealings with previous US presidents. The Europeans all got a kick out of that. The Americans looked at me and said, "What are you talking about?" But in fact, if you asked any European official, they would say they really liked working with the Biden administration, but at the end of the day, they do expect you to agree with them. Now, the nastier approach of Donald Trump is back, support or oppose his politics. It's a different type of diplomacy. And Europe is wrestling, of course, with its own various ructions. The German coalition has collapsed. There'll be an election on February 23rd. In France, President Macron is deeply weakened. We see some common threads, and yet it's hard to sometimes know how much in common. So maybe we can start, Dalibor, on the other end. Talk to us a little bit about who is the Trumpiest of European leaders. You have in Slovakia, where you come from, Fico could be a candidate. Viktor Orban, of course. Well, maybe we need to talk about George Meloni.
The sort of serious undertone of your question is that there is a lot of sort of back and forth and learning going on among aspiring authoritarians or populists, or however you want to label them. But maybe it's worth, kind of before tackling your question directly, to sort of step back and take, like you did, a sort of more historical perspective. So we already had an experience with one Trump administration and its policies towards Europe that were very often not received well on the other side of the Atlantic. And in the light of what has happened since, I do believe that Europeans, do have some, soul searching to do in this respect. Not all of the sort of complaints that the first Trump administration voiced about Europe were unfounded. Go back to 2017, 2018, Angela Merkel was sort of hailed as the leader of the free world, and you had a very abrasive ambassador in Berlin, Rick Grenell, who was constantly sort of poking at the Germans and making points that they didn't want to hear. Yet, whatever one thinks of Rick Grenell, he did have a point. I mean, Nord Stream 2 was a bad idea. German underinvestment into defense was a bad idea. Angela Merkel's decision to basically let in large numbers of asylum seekers in sort of uncontrolled way into Germany was not a great idea for Europe's political stability. And I'm not sure to what extent those sort of lessons of those years have sort of fully sunk in Europe and have led to a sort of more thorough re-evaluation of where the continent is. Now, looking forward from where we are now, I think there is a real tension, real contradiction at the heart of the European policy of the second Trump administration, which is that as the president would like to see Europe to rectify these mistakes and step up, address the issue of burden sharing in the alliance, take on a much greater responsibility towards Ukraine, and also, I suppose, close the sort of trade deficit that the US still has towards Europe. He's making allies and friends among the least responsible people in Europe, among people who are the least likely to actually respond constructively to these challenges. If you think that Viktor Orban is the one who will help to bring up defense spending in Hungary up, or Giorgia Meloni for that matter in Italy, or that these will be the people who will push for greater European investment in Europe as opposed to European investment flows to the United States, which are the flip side of the US trade deficit, I think you are sort of deluded. So there is really a sort of disconnect between the sort of rhetorical ambition of foreign policy people who are around the administration and the way the president himself behaves and people around him behave in sort of empowering really the worst elements from the AfD through Viktor Orban to, I'm not sure that there's been communication with Mr. Fico yet, but we can get to him in due course.
And so your vote for the Trumpiest of European leaders?
I'm sorry?
The most Trumpy of European leaders.
I think that people who very consciously watch developments in the United States and try to pitch themselves to American MAGA audiences, and I think Viktor Orban has been among those the most successful, very carefully tailoring his messages, very often totally out of sync with what's happening in Hungary proper, but really being able to read the room at Mar-a-Lago, at CPAC, and all these kinds of conferences. And I think he has made inroads with the current administration, with the current team, that just goes, is totally outsized relative to Hungary's role, and also completely out of whack with what Hungarian policies actually are vis-à-vis Russia, China, Iran, or indeed Ukraine.
But it's interesting, you point out Angela Merkel was seen at one point as the leader of the free world. Now, when she left office, right now we're hearing about AfD, the rise in the poll numbers of the Alternative for Germany, a far-right party. There seems to be a far-right wave sweeping Europe. That's what we see in the news pages. And yet, at the moment Angela Merkel left, Europe's conservatives were in the wilderness. I mean, it was amazing at one point, you had to go to Greece to find a center-right prime minister. They were all out. Janez Janša from Slovenia for a while was Europe's Trump, and he was out. Merkel and her conservatives were out. There's a question of whether we're seeing now a real wave, or is the pendulum just swinging as dissatisfied voters in Europe, like dissatisfied voters in the US, demand change. Maurizio, maybe you can talk to us about one of the first right-wing leaders to come back into power after that was Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy. Some warned that she was a fascist, more in the tradition of Mussolini. Some see her as actually a disciple of Silvio Berlusconi, a more outlandish, rambunctious leader. Help us understand, who is Giorgia Meloni? What are her politics like? Where is Italy at the moment in terms of...
Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. Giorgia Meloni is a politician, and in times in which the politics is very weak, it's just one element that is useful to understand. So she began her political activity while she was a teenager in the social movement, Italian social movement, which was the party that was born after the Second World War with fascist tropes, and then in the 90s had a secretary who changed the name of the party in National Alliance and didn't dismiss the symbol of the party, but became Friends of Israel, and he fought anti-Semitism and make one of the most important turn that Berlusconi permitted in Italian politics. So to bring in the area of the political forces in the government the ancient fascist party. Time changed. Then still now, Giorgia Meloni is capable to make a miracle similar to the one that on the political communication that Silvio Berlusconi did, to appear very new, although she's not. And Silvio Berlusconi was an entrepreneur, a media tycoon, and when some inquires about bribes in the 90s, dismantle the so-called Italian First Republic and hit in particular the governmental political forces, Silvio Berlusconi rebuilt a coalition of the parties that were before in the governments, but with the idea, I'm a manager, I'm not a manager, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm come out from the politics. I'm the new one, but with some old forces that supported him. Giorgia Meloni has been one of the youngest Italian female minister. If I'm not wrong, she was, the first time she went in government, she was 2017. And then she several times MP. She has been deputy president of the deputy chamber. But in the last election, 2 years ago, she presented herself as the newest one. And people, as with Berlusconi, with a different person, different personalities, accepted this idea that is the new. We have to try them. How do they? When she arrived at the government, she had a variety of aspects in her politics. The first examination was about the relationships with European Union, United States, and Israel, for example. She had a foreign politics that it was maybe better than the one of the other side on the stay, for example, on the Ukraine invasion, on the side of the Western world. Her party was pro-Russian before, not as the Northern League, but they had good relationship with the Kremlin. She understood, I think, more than for tactical reasons than for a culture or a tradition in that position, that it would have been difficult to govern without the approval of the United States, although the president was a Democrat. And she decided to stay on that side. At the same time, she created a new figures of felonies in the law with the measures that are passed in the parliament. The idea is to demonstrate that this is the tougher government against the crime, against the illegal immigration. But she went not in a center position, but in a less radical, less drastic position. And there was a race with the Northern League that was originally also anti-fascist, but it was a local force. That local force in politics, the empty space doesn't exist, so that she was becoming a little bit more moderate than it was expected. And so the Northern League became tough on some issues to demonstrate that the true rightist force is the Northern League. There is every day a race. It's traditionally in the Italian coalitions that you have concurrence between the closer you are, the most enemy you are with another party. And she has been accepted on an international stage. She has good relationships with Donald Trump, in particular with Elon Musk. And this can be a problem. I think that in these times when politics is weak, the strength of other kind of powers can make a problem for the democracy. And in this case, I wouldn't look to the fascist tradition. I will look to the ancient fascist tradition. I will look to that side of the politics, the relationships with the big techs, and in particular with Elon Musk, to understand what will go on and how much.
Let's stick for a second with the relationship, though, with Trump. Some people say that she might be Europe's best hope for engaging with Trump, with being the EU's sort of representative who will have Trump's ear, maybe not even because of her right-wing politics, but just because she looks the part. And we know Trump, she looks the part. She presents well. Trump likes people who look like they could go on his TV show.
She's an excellent propagandist. And she has a way to communicate that is Trump compatible. And this is possible. I think that she is looked from the White House, the current White House, as one of the beachheads in the European Union to try to divide the European Union. The problem here is that if European Union is divided, we have to remember, and she too has to do it, that for the Italian quality of life, two political causes determine our state, actual state. The European Union, the belonging to the European Union, the hugest common market in the world, and without tariffs. So for the Italian export, for the fourth country in the export in the world is very important. And the other is to belong to the NATO alliance. This permits to our country to have a good quality of life in some way. And you have to keep present to remember this, because if Trump tries to split, to divide the European Union, it can have also an economic cost for Italy. For example, it's true that Italy sells to the United States more than it buys from the United States. But if you break this game, also with your electorate, you can pay a price. So it will be interesting to understand what he will do and how much can be his an European voice or a voice of an ally of Trump.
Laura, let's talk about democracy and the extent to which democracy seems to be in jeopardy, that there is backsliding. We see the rise of, whether it's National Rally in France or the AfD in Germany or Geert Wilders' Freedom Party winning in the Netherlands. Certainly Donald Trump's victory showing a rightward swing in the US. But are these things connected? You're someone who's worked in democracy around the globe. Is it infectious from one country to another? Can the politics in Hungary influence what's happening in the US? And are there lessons that you see that Americans should draw from some of what's happened in Europe already?
Yes. Well, first, thank you, University of Chicago and International House. Yes, there is no peeing section of the swimming pool. These things are contagious and feed off one another. And what we're seeing across the transatlantic space, and I would say even more broadly, when I used to work for International IDEA, we did a global state of democracy report of 183 countries. And you see these waves. You saw the third wave of democracy that took place in the 90s. That's when I was sharpening my teeth as a democracy practitioner in Asia. Very exciting times. And it has a domino effect. So I was first posted in Bangkok, and then we were quickly seeing the contagion of democracy in Indonesia, the Philippines, et cetera. Of course, that's all gone backwards since. So certainly these trends do mimic each other, countries mimic each other, even cross the Atlantic. What we're seeing, I think, that's really important to keep our mind on is a lot of people that talk about democracy declining, they often say, oh, because democracy doesn't deliver. All of these things are true. Because of economic inequality, because representatives don't adequately represent the people, frustration with the global economy, feeling left out, industrialization, all of these things are true. Corruption, big player. But I think what we would see in our research and my work on the ground is this is a demand problem. And we talk so much at the institutional level, right? We talk about free and fair elections, we talk about parliaments, we talk about good governance and checks and balances, and this is all very important. We, the people, are electing strongmen. The problem is coming from us. And we haven't done an adequate job, we liberal democratic community, at addressing that demand side. What is going on there? And what our research, when I was at International IDEA, would repeatedly show is that often it came down to these cultural values divisions. That in fact, one scholar at Harvard, Pippa Norris, has controlled for all of the other factors like income inequality, rising immigration, et cetera. And in fact, the biggest determinant was how people viewed issues related to gender, LGBTQ, ethnic minorities, and the cultural and values divisions in society, which of course, aspiring strongmen tap into. It's no surprise that often the first acts that a new, populist, right-wing, illiberal leader does is remove their country from the Istanbul Convention, codify same-sex marriage, start going after issues related to gender, et cetera. These are, when I see this happening in a country, this is a red flag. When I lived in Georgia, not the state, the country Georgia in the Caucasus, I was there for 7 years. I knew in 2016 that the country was on a path to autocracy, because I saw that they started to follow these patterns. So I think the shared experiences of these leaders and these movements is happening across the Atlantic, across Europe. They do communicate with one another. We Democrats are a lot less effective than autocrats are at communicating. They share tactics, they share strategies, they have meetings. CPAC includes far-right members of our society here in the United States, with Hungarians, with my old country, Georgia. They attend, they share tactics and practices and lessons learned, whereas we Democrats are absolutely flat-footed, and we fail to go on the offensive. And what I've really seen that we've done, and it's a big failure, is we've ceded certain principles to far-right autocrats. Patriotism, faith, the national narrative of our country. We've just given it over. Rather than digging in and being like, hey, wait a minute, we're the patriots, we're a country of tolerance, we're a country of faith, and we've just ceded those things to these leaders, and they've taken advantage of it. So these trends are going to continue, and I hope it's a pendulum swing. We've seen it before. We've had movements like these. I've gone down a rabbit hole of the 1930s, for example. So we can hope that it swings back. But right now, we really are not responding adequately. And it's the worst possible time for democracy to be in decline when autocrats are on the offensive. This is the worst time for us to be divided and isolationist and turning into ourselves and fighting multiculturalism and fighting diversity and fighting transatlantic allies when we have Russia in Ukraine, we have China on the rise with ambitions in Taiwan. This is the worst time. So I am hoping that we can mobilize the way autocrats do and come together and come up with some better strategies to protect democracy, because it is not in a good place, and I don't see it improving in the near term.
It's an incredibly small world. I'm spending the year at Harvard as a Nieman Fellow and audited Pippa Norris's class in democratic backsliding this fall semester, and she's fantastic for those of you interested in the erosion of democracy. Her work is really important. Dalibor, maybe we can talk about one challenge that the far right has faced in Europe. We see, actually just now, Giorgia Meloni has finished up a term as head of the European Conservative and Reformist Party. Former Prime Minister Morawiecki from Poland is taking that over. But when you're xenophobic, it does present certain obstacles to being able to then reach across national boundaries and unite. If it's Poles for Poland or Slovaks for Slovakia, bringing these together based on your expertise in Central and especially in Eastern Europe, do you see something new potentially happening that could unite the far right in France with the far right in Germany with the far right in Hungary? Or do they end up unable to do that because they want to go their own way? And
so I do think that this is an alliance of convenience and a temporary one, because obviously a Europe governed by leaders who do have a zero-sum understanding of the world would lead to conflict, as it did in the past. For now, these conflicts have been sort of brushed away. So Viktor Orban does have a sort of not very well hidden revanchist agenda, trying to restore Hungary as it existed before the Treaty of Trianon, and that would go against the sort of Slovak nationalism of Robert Fico or against sort of nationalist leaders in other places, Serbia surrounding Hungary. But we are not at that stage yet. I think now they are like China and Russia working together against the common enemy. You have these leaders working together against what they perceive as a status quo. But I think it's important, I suppose, when we sort of think about how they're working together and how they influence each other, to think about dwell a little bit on the sort of common causes of this global phenomenon, as Laura rightly pointed out, because you can always sort of come up with these like parochial explanations for Trump, and it's the urban-rural divide, and in Europe you had austerity and you had inequality in the United States. But there is something really striking about the fact that this is happening in practically all advanced democracies. with slightly different manifestations. And really, what helped me understand that point fully was a few days before the Trump inauguration, I read this really striking piece by Peter Thiel in Financial Times, which was just full of conspiracy mongering from Anthony Fauci, wokeism, censorship, global complex, and he was sort of calling for the great unveiling of the crimes of the ancien regime, and then truth commissions that would sort of investigate all the depredations of the Biden regime, as he put it. And I was taken aback. I remember him as a sort of impressive entrepreneur back in the day, but I realized that this is what your brain looks like on a steady diet of social media content. I think young people in this room might have a word for that. Brain rot is the word. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I'm Generation Z or anything like that, but I think that's the word. You can say, you have Richard Hofstadter's paranoid style in American politics, but now it has spread. It has spread to Romania. We had a presidential candidate who claimed that fizzy drinks contain nanochips. You have a 2022 opinion poll in Slovakia that showed that 60% of my fellow Slovaks believe that 9/11 was an inside job by the US government. And so I do think that there is a sort of dominant part of this problem that is downstream from the way we consume political information. I don't think fact-checking, we can get into this later on, I don't think fact-checking and fight against misinformation is going to cut it for us. I think we have to just confront head-on the challenge posed by the sort of algorithmic content on these platforms, which is, there's some evidence that it's making people addicted, that is responsible for, plethora of mental health problems in the younger generation. But I think it is shaping our political culture on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond in a really unhelpful way.
Let's talk, because one common thread are these conspiracy theories, right? In Washington, it's the deep state. And in Brussels, it's the bureaucrat, or more specifically, the Eurocrat. That there's somehow an absence of democracy, that democracy has been co-opted. And when I got to Brussels in 2016, what struck me was that actually it wasn't a lack of democracy that afflicted Brussels. If anything, it was too much democracy. When those 27 heads of state, now 27, it was 28, of government get into a room on the European Council, any one of them has a veto, essentially, operating on the principle of unanimous consent in many cases, like the US Senate. But at the same time, they're all from elected governments, extremely representative governments. You point out that the problem is us, the voters. The voters, we say, journalists sometimes say, the voters get what they deserve. But Maurizio, talk to us about the level of support for the EU in Italy, because it's funny that has remained fairly strong, right? After Brexit, there isn't so much talk about an Italexit or...
Yeah, I think that Italian citizens should be more aware than they are of the importance of the European. Anyway, the support there is. I would like to stress something that Laura said. I think now we are in a phase in which the history that sometimes walks is running, and we see a lot of change. We have to the observer are focused on what's happening on the stage, and on the stage there are Trump and the Trumpists all over the world. But the thought is not enough. The analyses are not enough about the reasons of the defeat of the adversaries. And I think that we are living in an era of technological revolution, and it doesn't exist a revolution without dead and injured, without winners and losers. Maybe, I suspect that what happened is that on this stage of the technological revolution, that is different from when Hillary Clinton, as a Secretary of State, told that internet was a tool essential for the democracies because it killed the censorships and the possibilities of censorships, or it eliminated it. In this moment, the pragmatism of the right, which have some flags of old values, but very maverick in managing, in handling new problems, make the Reich more compatible to the other side of the new technologies and new communication that we have seen after that phase, which is the control, the possibility to influence, to use the data to move the public opinion in a side or in another. In this case, Italy has a support which is superior than other countries, maybe, but we need a new offensive of Europeanism, and to remember what's the reason of that negotiation you described. That is the alternative to the war. Nationalism in the histories brings the wars. And the European Union, with the support of the United States, not as now, the birth of the European Union was after a Second World War that our country began in the wrong side and then continued in the right side. But deciding what? Deciding that we had to share the production of the materials that were used to build the weapons, the steel, the coal, French and German that were fighting among them before. And to decide to make long, also during the night, meeting instead of short one against each other. That is the European Union. And we should be more proud of this kind of choice. I mean, democracies and democratics has to go to the offensive and to be aware and transmit to the new generation. We didn't know that, for example, now I use the passport to come in the United States. But when I was a kid, I used the passport also to go to France and to Germany. Now today I can go without. One of the European commissioners 15 years ago told me one of the main efforts she has done was to have the possibility to use the same cell phone with roaming in the European countries without paying a difference as it was before. And she's told, I never had so much pressure against my decision to try to make the only fare for all the services. And this is our small things, but also material things. Trump and supporters of Trump had the capability to choose which side of the loser they would like to represent. Right or wrong, they had a segment of the society that they decided they want that with him. I don't think that on the other side, the troubles of the middle class has been so proudly recognized and indicated as the one that they have to be preserved. And
I just want to emphasize for our American audience, the single most popular thing the EU has ever done was end roaming charges for cell phone use. No question, right? After that, the visa-free travel zone, and after that, maybe the assistance that came after the pandemic. Certainly we saw a shift in public opinion. I want to talk a little bit about our friends in the UK and Brexit and how things have worked out. And it goes at this issue that some of you raised around conspiracy theories and propaganda. Again, when I got to Brussels in 2016, we were in the throes of Brexit, and Nigel Farage and others were telling British citizens that they were slaves to the EU, that in fact their country was being controlled by these bureaucrats. I looked around, again, not being an expert in European affairs then, and said, wait a minute, you guys sit there between France that does all the talking and Germany that has all the money and the power and kind of make the decisions. The court system, the legal structures are all based on British institutions. So you could be leaders of this bloc of 330 million people, or you could be a small island nation with bad weather and bad food. Years later, the British economy is in a disaster. Brexit has not delivered the promises that it was supposed to. The Tories were routed in an election. Does this tell us, maybe I'll start with you, Laura, that eventually folks figure out and see through the propaganda? Maybe they learn the hard way?
It's funny that you say that, because I was having a conversation with my friend in London, and right after the election of Donald Trump, and I started to think, oh, well, maybe if we just do all the MAGA, let's just do all of the MAGA things, and then people will see it, and they'll be like, no, this is bad. And she looks at me and she goes, do you know how many people who voted for Brexit would still vote for Brexit again? I think, or like a cult, doomsday, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Oh, the day comes, oh, doomsday doesn't happen. Do you think the cult members abandon the cult? No, they double down. I think on the space of information, one, and to your point, I think the manipulation of truth or the ownership of truth is ancient, right? Autocrats have used that forever. The introduction of a new format for spreading information always creates this insane and chaotic period. So it's not the internet, right? So we had Father Coughlin in the 30s, who was on radio and had more followers and listeners than Tucker Carlson ever did, right? So it was radio, it was print, then it was radio, now it's the internet. Information has always been manipulated. Owning facts and owning truth is the tool that autocrats use to confuse and manipulate people. But the other thing is that I've worked a lot on countering disinformation, et cetera, and we focus so much on, if we could just get people the facts, if we just got them the facts, then everything would change. Oh, if we just turned off Fox News, then everything would change. And what I think we're not getting at is this is about hearts more than minds. And one of my favorite stories is a US story. A man named Gabriel Sterling, who you might recall from the state of Georgia, who was testifying in front of the January 6th Commission, and he was a Trump voter. He's an election worker, election official, and he said Biden won the 2020 elections, and his family went bananas, right? So he describes this conversation with his cousin, who's like, well, what about the flash drive and the da-da? And he patiently said, no, that didn't happen. No. And then the cousin said, well, what about da-da-da? And he said, no, that didn't happen. And he went through, and he was the best messenger. He had trust. He was a Republican, and he went through every single conspiracy that his cousin had. And at the end, his cousin threw up his hands and said, I don't care. I believe it in my heart. We are not dealing with facts, people. We can try, and I'm not saying that we should dispense with fact-checking, but I do think we need to really think about how we get at what's driving people to want to believe things. And that is where the conspiracies come in. And that's where, yes, one would think, oh man, the British economy is totally sunk, but as my friend Sandra said, her parents still were like, Brexit's the right thing. Because it's not really about the things people say it's about. It's about something deeper and more emotional. It's about tribe. It's about a feeling of identity. And it's about us versus them. And it's not about facts. And I think if we start to try to, and I'm not saying that's easy, and I'm not saying I have the answers, but we need to sort of peel away from this, maybe if we, and I have evidence of this, by the way, regulating news. And I think the EU, God bless them for trying their best. I'm really glad that Elon Musk is having a hard time there with the regulations they've put in place. But I did a study, it turned out to be perfect because the German elections took place before the ban and the French elections took place after the ban. So you would think, oh my God, perfect case study, right? Controlled treatment, here we go. The French elections, even though RT, Russia Today, was banned, even though Russian state media was banned, it was there. It finds a way. It was like Chinese diplomats are like, hold my beer, I gotcha. And then they were funneling all that information. It's laundered through all these different sites. Right now today in Germany, where there's a ban on Russian media, there are 100 websites that have been created to funnel Russian disinformation into the German public. So I'm not saying we can't try that approach, but I think if we're not getting at the root causes that drives people to want to believe these things, we're not really going to make a lot of progress.
The day after Brexit vote in Great Britain, one of the most asked questions to Google was, what's the European Union?
Yeah.
It's true.
Here it was tariffs. What are tariffs?
Yeah. And so in a university that studies political science, I think we have to remember that we have new tools, but this is not new. I mean, when I explained to my daughter what was the communist theory and the possibility that it arrives at the last stadium at the end of the state, and everyone was taking from the society what they need and giving what they could do. She was 10 or 11, and she said, what a children logic. Is it impossible? So, I mean, in the history of the politics, the dreams sold like strategies or therapies are not a new phenomenon on this time. What is the difference is that everything is going faster, and also that the social network have the trend to polarize the public opinion. And I think, for example, in Europe, that there is, we have seen with no vax, we have seen with Brexit, we've seen in Spain with the request to separate Catalonia. There are some local issues in which the public can be divided, and they are sometimes genuinely local. But there is something like when you go in the agriculture and you put the substance out, I don't find the English word to make grower faster.
Fertilizer.
And fertilizer.
The fertilizer. I think a part of this fertilizer come from Russia, and they come with the new tools. That was Russia made this information also before during the so-called Cold War, but now it can do it. It's enhanced this trend to the divisions, and we have a time in which, after decades of contestation against the power, we have to rebuild the idea of an authority, which is not just the power. And I think it's a great problem in the university, because you will study, but with social network, the voice that will be heard can be the one that has not studied. And so we have to remember that this trend to be to go on the wrong way by the public opinions is very common when we see the people that vote against their interests, like with the Brexit electorate. We have to remember, and also sometimes to study, that each one of us is vulnerable to this trend. Think to the people that suffer for giving money to investors that promise more than in the reality they can give back. When a love is finished and someone thinks that it's not true, it will continue. When you choose a doctor, not because he has the better therapy, but because he's the one that says that you can avoid a surgery. I mean, it's in the aim in our personality to try someone to be how do we say, fascinated by something that is untrue. The problem is to try to rationalize and to find the way that the rationalization, the reason can have the cultural hegemony that can be steeled by social network and these trends.
And it's interesting how sometimes the lack of information can be useful, right? Jens Stoltenberg, the former Secretary General of NATO, convinced Donald Trump that he had rescued the alliance by forcing allies to pay more. Trump would say often, the coffers are filling up, not understanding still that in fact NATO spending is counted not by how much money comes in, but by how much money the allies spend out on their own militaries, right?
This is a problem. On a European point of view, it's true that we have to spend more for the defense because the time has changed since the end of the division in the world in two sides, one influenced by Russia and one by the United States. But this is a terrible problem. We have to find a way to be more secure with better awareness of the risks of the world we are facing. Yeah.
So we're going to open it up to questions now. There should be microphones around. I think students have priority.
So, sorry, what I was thinking is when Trump says, if they don't pay, we don't help them to defend themselves from Putin, this is an attack to the deterrence of the NATO based on the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which says if one is attacked, when one state is attacked, has the right to ask the others to support themselves.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today and for moderating this event. My name is Dahlia. I'm a third year in the college. I'm studying psychology and public policy. Everything you guys have said has been really interesting about like the kind of similarities maybe between like Trump and other autocratic leaders across Europe. But I guess I was wondering, given the trend that I would consider kind of like a caving in these past couple weeks or months since the election from like maybe more presumably liberal or like at least on the face before more resistant to the Trump administration in his first term, they're kind of, in my opinion, again, like giving in this second time around and kind of obeying in advance or even supporting his administration, however you would like to categorize it within the United States. Do you think that like more liberal leaders who are maybe more staunchly opposed or like vocally distrustful of the Trump administration the first time around are going to stay steadfast in that opposition? Or do you think they're going to follow kind of these like American institutions in that kind of cave given this second term?
Can you just give us a quick example of who you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just thinking, even like if you think about like media, like not just the news, although I do think that there's a lot of not strong enough news coverage or like not attacking enough news coverage. But even if you think about like Disney or all these other like creative media corporations that seem to be like a lot more accepting of like the, like I know Disney was going to have like either like a trans or like a gay storyline in one of the pieces of media they were putting out, and they like just coincidentally like decided that like, oh, that's not important to us anymore. And like I feel like that kind of like rainbow capitalism era is kind of fading. I don't know if that's like 100% an example, but I don't know. I guess I'm wondering if you think like the liberal leaders are gonna give in because this is the second time around, or stay steadfast in their opposition across the Atlantic.
So I'm going to turn to Laura in a second. I mean, one thing I would tell you is that as a journalist, my reaction is listen to what they say, watch what they do. And so as we come up on a series of confirmation votes in Congress, let's see where they're voting. And so far, I think the Democrats have been holding rank, right? And it's a question of which Republicans are turning against some of these nominees. But it will be a test. I mean, there is also some recognition, right, that a majority of the country voted for this president, like it or not, and an effort to respect that result in the vote. But Laura, go ahead.
No, it really resonates. Your question really resonates with me because I was having coffee yesterday with a dear friend from Hungary who's like, wake up, right? We know what's coming next, and you Americans, you are, maybe it's a strength, but we always think that somehow we'll pull through. Oh, we got through the first time. Oh, our institutions will hold. Oh, it's so great. We're so strong. We're so exceptional that it can't happen here. And if you talk to any Eastern European, they will tell you, wake up. You're boiling frogs. And I'll give an example of obeying in advance, and I'm not going to name names here, but I went to a meeting. I live in Washington, D.C., and I went to a meeting with a bunch of different democracy organizations that work both internationally and domestically. And they are already scrubbing their websites They are self-censorship is not going far enough. They are compromising the kinds of work they do. They're cleansing their programming of the word LGBTQ gender. You can argue this is smart because they want to make sure they continue. Now they have no funding because they just cut all foreign aid. But at that time, they were like, oh, we need to continue, so we'll make compromises in how we sell things, not necessarily altering our values. My Hungarian friend said that's how it starts.
Yeah.
You first cover it up and pretend, oh, but I'm still going to do that thing. I'm just going to call it this so that I don't get in trouble. That you're already compromised. I'd just say one more thing that I was thinking walking over here when one of the questions was posed to us by the organizers, what's the same about what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic and what's different? I actually see a lot of similarities in our democratic decline and the rise of illiberalism and the rise of far-right populism, et cetera, backlash to cultural diversity, wanting to restore traditional order, pecking order and power. Where I do see a difference, and you referred to it in the first Trump administration, is resistance. I look at my friends and family in the country, Georgia. They are out in the streets every night for 60 days until 4 a.m. protesting. You look at what's happening in Serbia, people all over. You look at Slovakia, people protesting, citizens really taking. And here, I feel like we've all been hit with a stun gun. Maybe it'll kick in, but right now, it's sort of two sides. It's not just the political opposition, it's public resisting.
Do we have questions in the balcony? I was asked to alternate. No?
Oh, just kidding.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
I can jump in here. Hey folks, thank you for being here. My name is Christopher Phillips. I'm a 4th year in the college. My question is primarily for Mrs. Thornton, although if anybody else has input, feel free to jump in as well. You've spoken extensively about the need to protect democracy and uphold democratic norms and practices. And the definition of democracy, I think, is a little nebulous and differs from person to person, but just at a very basic level, we can probably agree it's something like broad civic participation and voting rights and accessibility with the free flow of information in the body politic. That's kind of a general idea of democracy. A lot of people connect it or believe it's fundamentally connected to liberalism. Many people have a different idea, as a matter of fact. But you've spoken extensively about the need to protect democracy and uphold those norms. But to me, at least, it seems like those arguments that you've presented have actually probably been more applicable, at least in a more genuine way, to liberalism, to an argument in favor of liberalism. That's what you've been arguing for. And my question is, you've talked about people who are illiberal, people who don't have liberal beliefs as cultists. You said people in MAGA are like those in a cult. You said they vote with their heart, not with their brain, and this is not about facts, it's about emotions. And so my question to you is, in certain countries in Eastern Europe, like I think of Belarus, you have censorship in those countries. I will totally acknowledge those elections are not free and fair. A lot of fishy stuff going on in that country in particular. But you also have countries in Western Europe, like Italy and Germany and France and Netherlands, where you don't have those kinds of conditions present. You don't have authoritarian regimes of censorship. And actually, it seems to me at least that you've been arguing in favor. Absolutely there is. You've been arguing against free speech in some cases in terms of countering disinformation. So in those countries where you don't have a huge regime of censorship, is it important to protect democracy when those leaders on the right are being elected by the people in countries where people are coming to their own conclusions? Or is it only important to protect democracy when they are candidates who are elected whose ideology you agree with personally?
Great question. So in terms of defining democracy, trust me, it killed me. At International Idea, we had to develop this whole conceptual framework and it took forever. On your point about liberal democracy, I think is what you're getting at, versus the so-called Viktor Orban termed illiberal democracy. I would challenge you that illiberal democracy is an oxymoron. And it's true that while that leader might have got gotten elected freely and fairly in a democratic election the first time. What they do once they're in power is erode exactly what you're talking about, erode freedom of press, erode institutions, go after the judiciary, benefit their friends through forms of kleptocracy, put constraints on civil society. One of the first things they do is pass a foreign agents law that labels civil society organizations. So in my belief, after you've done that, how do you have a democratic election when you've thwarted the playing field to such a degree that it can be neither free nor fair? So democracy, if you're just talking about democracy in terms of electoral democracy, okay, whoever the majority wins. If you're looking at a democracy, I view that as electoral autocracy. If you're looking at the more comprehensive view of democracy, which is constitutionalism, protection of minority rights, checks and balances, freedom of speech, those are liberalism. So I would say a liberal democracy is not a thing. Even though you're right, there are many leaders, Viktor Orban being one, Erdogan being another, that have made that case very persuasively. The public has chosen us. We won.
Thank you.
I think it's very important to listen to the questions like this, because we can't have a future of the democracy if we don't give an answer to this kind of questions. And I think that democracy, one of the best definitions was given by Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister, when he said, "It's the worst form of government if you exclude all the others." And in the Italian constitution, the first article of the constitution states that sovereignty belongs to the people, and that has to be realized according to the procedures established by the constitution. So that is the power, but the way in which you express the power are substance, not just formal. And so it's important that we are not defending the idea of one side or another. I mean, at least I'm not defending one side. I think that we need long-term, long life for the democracies. So to avoid that there is a moment in which the weakness of the democratic systems and the strength of other kind of powers that don't respond to the people change the rules and change our possibility also to change idea and to go from from a side to another.
And just one quick last point from the cynical journalist perspective, taking a pretty dim view of both of the major parties in the United States. I don't think there's anything particularly liberal about the balance of powers and checks and balances in government. So Article 1 of the Constitution obviously is the Congress, and I'd point you to some interesting coverage lately of how the Speaker's office appears to be diminished at the moment, which is something you did not see in previous Republican or Democratic controlled Congresses, where I've covered Congress for years at the New York Times. There was a lot of pride in its independence from the White House, right? And I think when you see those pillars starting to crumble a little bit, starting to erode, that's the concern rather than whether it reflects one ideology or another. Let's move on to the next question.
Sorry, if I just, really quickly, because I love your question, sir. One of the failures I think that we made in the democracy promotion community was in the 90s, I'm old, was a great deal of focus on electoral democracy and majoritarianism at the expense of constitutional protections, minority rights, et cetera. And a lot of the countries I worked in where we were just so focused on getting those free and fair elections, neglecting all these other aspects of a strong civil society, an independent press, a fair rule of law, et cetera. And that, I think that is why they were like a house of cards. They went through a couple, like I lived in Thailand, they went through a couple good elections and they were like, poof, because without those roots of those other aspects beyond elections, it's not going to last. All those countries are autocracies now.
We're gonna move to, we have a line, so let's move to the next question. And please, if you can, get to the question quicker so we can get to as many answers as possible.
Yes. My name is Dan. I'm a fourth-year student at the college. You all touched on the rise of misinformation on social media and connected that to nationalist leaders in Europe. My question is, do you think this issue is unique to the global right? And if it's not an equally sized problem on the left, why is that?
If I may, I think it's important to sort of dwell on dimensions of this problem that are not new. There's something in political science known as rational ignorance, right? Like whereas, like in my daily life, I try to gather the best available information and act in a sort of responsible way on matters that affect me personally, my wealth, my health. When it comes to political decision making, as a voter, the incentive to do that is pretty weak. So the fact that voters might vote whimsically or be susceptible to propaganda or various kind of emotional messages or voting for a candidate because he looks good on television, that's been always there. I think what is new is not so much misinformation, disinformation, but rather algorithms that drag people on the right and left, by the way, down various rabbit holes. And I think much of what we see in politics is downstream of that. It's not about dis or misinforming the public per se. When you look at the sort of messages that Russian propaganda, for example, spreads online, like those would include some blatant lies, but they would also include some true statements. I mean, the fact that Kievan Rus is called Rus, and therefore the sort of roots of Russian Orthodoxy are in Kiev. I mean, that's a historical fact which is irrelevant to the current situation in Ukraine, or the fact that Nikita Khrushchev handed over Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Again, truthful statement, irrelevant. And there are debatable propositions as part of that. I think it's this sort of ecosystem that people are marinating in that has displaced traditional media, and that has provided incentives for political actors to kind of play, to those people sort of seeking those dopamine hits on social media that is shaping the environment we are in. So I would definitely argue it's a cross-ideological, cross-partisan problem that is well alive across different geographies around the world.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Juan Leal Mendoza. I'm a fourth year at the college, and for my senior thesis, I'm looking at U.S. military withdrawal attempts throughout history. So that has been a topic that's come back recently in the context of Europe. That is, Trump announcing the withdrawal of 20,000 troops, something that he remarkably tried to do during his first term, to the exact same number of troops. Obviously, the big change of context in the European security context since 2020 to now is the war in Ukraine, the invasion in Ukraine. So my question is, if you all could speak a little bit about the implications, the European security context of this return of an American government that's more inwards looking now that, of course, there's the conflict in Ukraine ever present in mind in Europe.
There's a school of thought that answers your question by saying, well, therefore Europeans will step up and fill the vacuum left by the United States. I mean, the sort of traditional realists would be sort of keen to argue that. I don't think it works that way. And going back to Maurizio's earlier remarks on the European project, I think one element that's left out of the equation is that this tremendous success of European integration happened under a US security umbrella, which took off strategic issues off the table for the Europeans. And what future awaits Europe once that security umbrella is removed, I think is very unclear. There was one interesting case study in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s when the Clinton administration made the decision to basically defer to the Europeans to sort of sort this crisis which was at their doorstep. It ended in a disaster. Americans had to come in and step in and sort of deal with the outcome. So if you have, we have to wonder whether it's politically sustainable indefinitely to have US presence in Europe going forward, but if that presence ends, whether you see Europeans stepping up or whether you see fragmentation as a result of just different sort of strategic views taken by different countries. I mean, for Italy, what happens in the Mediterranean is probably of much greater concern than Russia's threat to NATO's eastern flank. You have countries that are very acutely concerned about the Russian threat. You have countries that are kind of Russia's fifth column within Europe. So how that sort of adds up to a coherent strategic whole, I think, is very unclear at this stage.
But just quickly, I think we have to wait and see on the Trump administration, just to give you a sense of how these things swing. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison represented Texas, was a big driving force for bringing back troops from Europe to bases in Texas. Then she became ambassador to NATO and was helping to move troops back into position in Europe as the Russian threat was rising. So let's wait and see. Let's try to get to one or two more questions if we can.
Thank you.
Before we have to wrap up. You're welcome.
Hi, my name's Ken. I am a Master of Arts candidate in the International Relations at the university, and I specialize in European security and European politics. My question to you is kind of related to the last question, but you were saying that European countries should step up. So what do you mean exactly by step up in anticipation of a potential US withdrawal or the lack of, or I guess like the divergence of interest between European Union and NATO?
I suppose stepping up in this immediate context just means making sure that Russia doesn't win in Ukraine and making sure that Europe is able to defend itself and deter Russia. That means massively ramping up defense spending, defense budgets, which again, like if you underspend for decades, you create the hole that you will not be able to fill in 2 or 3 years that you spent 3-4% of GDP on defense. I think Europe needs to get its act together in terms of its economy and the fiscal choices that are being made. You can't have guns and butter at the same time. There are trade-offs to be made. You have massive debt burdens in some of the central key European sort of countries. Whether that can happen in the context of deep political dysfunction in France and Germany, key players within the EU, is an open question. I mean, for decades, these countries have kind of tried to, again, like as part of marginalizing, trying to sort of keep the far right and the insurgent populists out of power. They ended up with sort of party systems that don't really add up to anything coherent governance-wise. I mean, in France there is no governing majority for anything in particular. Germany will end up with hopefully with a coalition that can achieve something, but it's far from being a foregone conclusion. So I think we'll sort of see or not quite soon whether Europe can step up.
Richard, you want to answer?
Just fascinating to say how much European security is important also for the United States. Have you seen what happened after the American and international withdrew from the far Afghanistan in the world? The invasion of Ukraine and Middle East, October 7. I mean, I wouldn't like, not just because I'm European, an unsafe Europe.
Just quickly a point on how it's not just money. France is the only nuclear power in Europe, doesn't participate in the nuclear planning group at NATO. Macron could get up and say he extends his nuclear umbrella to protect Europe. He hasn't said that. And let's not forget that the Americans have actually wanted Europe to be dependent on the US for security.
Oh, yeah.
To give some context. Let's try and do one more question if we could.
Thank you.
Right up against the clock here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a study exchange student from Central European University in Vienna, Austria. And my question would be regarding the European conservatives, but also European governing parties in general, have attempted to move to the right to head off the illiberal far-right forces. So in Austria, the ruling conservatives, a very powerful political party, shifted to the right and lost this election last September. And there's likely going to be a far-right chancellor coming in the next months. The same thing in Germany is most likely about to happen, a shift to the right, and still that party will lose. The Dutch have shifted to the Dutch liberal centrists have shifted to the right. So given that this strategy does not seem to be particularly effective, do you have commentary on that strategy or alternative strategies? I mean, in the postmortem of the Democratic loss, red state Democrats say the Democrats need to move to the center, and people like Bernie Sanders say they need to get back to income inequality and away from culture wars. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Look, I think much of this is context dependent. I am not concerned by the populist impulse in politics per se, or by the nationalist impulse in politics per se. I'm concerned about political forces that are able to undo the rules of the democratic game and that are also destroying, the Western alliance or the EU from within. And I think there are differences to be made between the forces that we very often casually just label as populist or nationalist. I don't think Giorgia Meloni is a threat to the Italian constitutional system. I don't think Italians sort of go to bed at night worrying the way people in this room might worry about what President Trump will do next. I think Viktor Orban has entrenched himself in the power in a way that it's meaningless to talk about Hungary as an electoral democracy. The fact that Sweden Democrats are sort of backing the existing center-right coalition in Sweden again, doesn't wake me up at night. I'm not worried about Swedish democracy. British Tories, even at the sort of peak Brexit hysteria, were not the threat to the constitutional system in the country. So I think these distinctions are important to be made, and I think how you sort of deal with the populist impulse in politics depends on the specific situation. I think ostracization of a neo-Nazi party is perfectly reasonable as an approach, but I think it might be equally reasonable if that party undergoes change and that you attempt to sort of socialize those leaders in a way that they no longer present a threat to the constitutional system or to the Western alliance. So I think you have dozens of case studies across Europe of of situations that have sort of worked out in a more benign fashion, and situations that really have led either to political dysfunction, like in Germany and France, or to incumbent entrenchment and autocracy, like in Hungary.
A perfect answer to wrap us up. Context is key, and of course we hear these common echoes from one side of the ocean to the other. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our panelists, and
Thank you.
to the politics.